Hello, this is Simon Brew. I'm the editor of Film Stories magazine, and a very warm welcome to the Film Stories podcast. It's all about the love of movies. What do you love?
I'd really love not to go to prison. I can't even begin to describe how much I would love not to go to prison.
Come with me.
And I show you how deep the rabbit hole goes.
And movies that had stories.
That the story just sucks them in.
This is just the beginning.
Stories. We would be honored if you would join us.
Hello and a very warm welcome to Film Stories with Simon Brew. I am Simon Brew, as always, all you need to know about me. The aim of the podcast, though, is completely given away in the title. I'm here to talk of the stories of film, and I tend to look at development stories, marketing stories, production stories, release stories, all those ingredients that go to make the films that we know and sometimes love, just that, the films that we know and sometimes love. The films I tend to cover in this podcast are more mainstream leaning than anything else. They're films I'm certainly interested in or invested in to some degree. I try not to punch down. I try not to do snark. This podcast is a celebration of cinema, of the fact that films get made. They're really hard to get made. I want to salute the fact that we get to see them. Without further ado then, I'm just going to get started with the first of the two films I'm going to talk about in this episode of Film Stories. I'm going to go back to 2004 for this one. Let me play you a clip and I'll come to the story the other side of this.
All his life, Benjamin Gates has searched for a treasure no one believed existed.
Don't you get it, Ben? The treasure is a myth.
Dad, I refuse to believe that.
But what he thought was the final clue
108 years of searching and I'm 3 feet away.
is only the beginning.
The Declaration of Independence.
You think there is a treasure map on the back of the Declaration of Independence?
The map is invisible.
Why would we make this up?
Where's your proof?
We don't have it.
Riley, get down!
Did Bigfoot take it?
Word about the map is bound to get out. Ian's gonna try to steal it. 90 seconds. The only way to protect the Declaration is to steal it.
What?
I'm gonna steal the Declaration of Independence.
And that's a clip from 2004's National Treasure, directed by John Turteltaub, this one. A screenplay by Jim Cowth, Cormac Wibberley and Marianne Wibberley. Story credit goes to Jim Cowth, Oren Aviv and Charles Seegers. And starring Nicolas Cage, Harvey Keitel, John Voight, Diane Kruger, Sean Bean, Justin Bartha and Christopher Plummer. All in the ensemble for this particular one. And the genesis of National Treasure came up towards the back end of the 1990s. And a man called Oren Aviv, who was at that stage the head of creative advertising at Disney, came to director John Turteltaub with an idea for a film. This basic idea: what would happen if someone wanted to steal, in the US, the Declaration of Independence? Now, Aviv was working with a man called Charles Seegers, who was at DreamWorks TV at the time, and John Turteltaub had certainly built up a degree of currency with Disney, with surprise hits, primarily Cool Runnings while he was sleeping. That had been successful. He was in the midst of making the John Travolta headline Phenomenon as well, and there was something there. He was a fan of adventure movies. This seemed like the kind of project he wouldn't mind tackling. The research for it thus got underway, and the writing team, with Turteltaub on board as well, just started doing bits and bobs of research around, well, how can you do a treasure hunt movie but just change the outlook of it slightly? Can you use actual historical truths to be the base of it? And this was the era in which the Da Vinci Code book was about to spring up as well. And how could they just make it a bit more of almost a detective story, really? And so research was done on people who were involved in heists, or certainly specialists of heists, to look at, if you were to steal the US Declaration of Independence, how would you go about it? And so what they started to do was formulate a script and a story that would be realistic enough to full audiences, but also provide the basis for an action adventure, a kind of Indiana Jones style kind of thing. And so eventually, I mean, this was set up at Disney, and as soon as it was starting to move, Jim Cowth, who'd written the screenplay for things like Rush Hour and the first Stakeout film, he was hired to do the first draft of the script for the project. Jerry Bruckheimer would come aboard as producer not long afterwards. Now, Jim Cowth would be the first of many to take a punt at the screenplay, but he was important important to getting it moving, and to the point where the film was actually formally announced in February 1999 in an article in Variety, when it was revealed that Touchstone Pictures, the adult arm of Disney, not like that, was set to make National Treasure, and it got this July the 4th opening weekend planned for the year 2000. Already talks, Variety reported, were underway with McDonald's for a tie-in Happy Meal, and other merchandising work was underway as well. It was reported, falsely as it turned out at this point, that John Turteltaub was already in place to direct this one. He was going to make The Kid for Disney first. In fact, he was just in the midst of that. Phenomenon had gone on to be a hit, and National Treasure was going to be a slightly different, a slight change of pace for him, budgeted at around $60 to $90 million, and it was described as a modern-day treasure hunt for a Revolutionary War secret stash of cash hidden by Jefferson, Washington and Franklin to help finance the war. Now, this film was getting the green light at a point where Disney was not for the first time in that decade in a bit of a transformational period. At the start of the 1990s, Disney was notably frugal. It had spent big on Dick Tracy in 1990, trying to recreate the success that Warner Brothers had had with Batman the year before. In the aftermath of Dick Tracy not making a lot of money, Disney then became notoriously tight, and it stepped away from big movie tentpoles and paying huge star salaries, and instead was gearing more towards making a family movie every week or two in cinemas. Now, as it went into the back end of the 1990s, it started spending again. It invested in Michael Bay's Armageddon at great expense, for instance. It was soon to stump up for Pearl Harbor. But there was a change of management coming at the studio again after the amount of money that was spent on Armageddon. The plan was that Disney would go frugal again. So National Treasure didn't necessarily fit that, and there was a little bit of an intent within the halls of Disney to show that it could still compete when it came to big blockbuster projects. Here was Jerry Bruckheimer, who'd brought all sorts of success in the 1990s alone to the studio, the likes of Con Air, the likes of The Rock, and films of that ilk. And so, as John Turteltaub told Variety at this point, just said the film will have its share of special effects, but it's a really big action-adventure comedy. But for me, he said, I still think of it as a character piece. So that budget did reverse some economising that Disney had been doing. However, the idea that it would land in the summer of 2000 was soon proven to be false. That said, Disney was setting up, to give you an idea where it originally pitched National Treasure, the way that it was working its labels at that point. The Touchstone imprint, as I mentioned, was more for adult pictures, or ones that weren't overtly for a family audience. They had a bit more of an edge to them. It also had the Hollywood Pictures label as well that was doing that. And so National Treasure, it figured, was more a Touchstone film than a Disney film at that stage, and it put it into production, or certainly into development, with that in mind. However, the week after that Variety story dropped, news came that Tom Cruise and Steven Spielberg were going to have Minority Report for that weekend instead, and that didn't quite go entirely to plan either. But still, it was becoming clear that the July 4th weekend of 2000 was going to be quite competitive. And also the bigger problem was that the script for National Treasure wasn't moving along at enough speed, that the project also didn't have a movie star for it. And so it sort of went off radar a little bit. And so by November of 2000, with no sign of the film appearing, John Turteltaub was instead circling another project. Now, this was an article called Positively Fifth Street, Murderers, Cheaters and the 2000 World Series of Poker. Now, that article had appeared in Harper's Magazine, or was about to, written by a man called Jim McManus. And Turteltaub had optioned this with a view of it being a feature. And all of a sudden, it was unclear whether he would direct that or National Treasure. And he had a slate of options opening up. It had been a good year or so since he'd wrapped up all his work on The Kid, starring Bruce Willis. And we still didn't quite know what he was going to do next. So the next time he popped up in the news was early in 2001, and this related to his production company, Junction Entertainment, that he ran with Christina Steinberg. And that Junction Entertainment had a deal set up with Disney, and in January 2001, a 3-year extension of that deal was inked. But in the Variety report that noted that, it also pointed out that Turteltaub hadn't picked what his next directorial outing was going to be at that stage. That said, it did appear that National Treasure was edging edging into the lead. But the problem still remained. There wasn't actually a finished script yet in place. That the Variety report noted that Changing Lanes writer Chap Taylor was the latest to have a stab at it, and he was in the midst of reworking the screenplay, but that wasn't now due until March of 2001. And so that gave Turteltaub a bit of time again to explore, well, will he really be going for this particular film next? And so finally in July of 2001, he committed to it. Now, notably, he committed to National Treasure at a point where Disney had put another project on his slate that he was interested in getting made. And it's a film that I've covered in a previous episode of the Film Stories podcast, Enchanted. Delightful movie, Enchanted. But it turned out that there was a moment where it was either Enchanted or National Treasure was going to go first. But Enchanted was hitting a couple of delays. And so what Turteltaub reasoned was, I'll do National Treasure first and then I'll direct Enchanted after that. Now, Enchanted would hit an assortment of challenges and Turteltaub would drop out of that. Eventually, Kevin Lima would step in to helm that one. But the important thing here was that National Treasure was finally going ahead. It was expected to start filming in March of 2002. And so, it was time to go and find a star. And this is where Jerry Bruckheimer came into his own, because Jerry Bruckheimer, the Uber producer, has a contacts book of big Hollywood stars and wasn't afraid to ring a couple of them up. There was, however, one still further hurdle that National Treasure had to negotiate, and that was another bit of jigglery-pokery behind the scenes of Disney. That in December 2001 there was a change of management again, that it was revamping its film arm at that stage. This was Disney pre-Marvel and pre its extraordinary run of success that we know it for now. It brought in a new executive, a man called Bill Mechanic, who'd worked at Fox, to help oversee its movie slate. And so some films survived, some films didn't. National Treasure, in this case, managed to survive the change of regime. Now, let's move over to Nicolas Cage, and not before time, because at this stage in his career, he'd redefined himself as an action star as well as an Oscar-winning dramatic actor in the 1990s. He won his Oscar for Leaving Las Vegas, of course. Then he made that extraordinary action trilogy, The Rock, Con Air, Face Off. But he'd just done a film called Matchstick Men with Ridley Scott, and he'd taken nearly a year away from movies at this point to try and find what he wanted to do next. And the problem was, screenplays really weren't that clicking for him. He wasn't an actor known for sequels at this stage. He still barely is, I'd suggest. And he was always looking to take a kind of left turn somewhere along the line. And then the script came along for National Treasure, and it turned out he liked it. And he explained to Chud.com why he ultimately leaned towards taking the role of Ben in the National Treasure movies. And he said that he thought the very thing that made him trepidatious about it was the same thing that intrigued me, which is the idea of a man going in and stealing the Declaration of Independence. And Cage admitted, I thought, this doesn't seem very plausible. How can this actually be pulled off? And so Cage met with John Turteltaub and they discussed this. And as Cage would report, he found him audacious and bold. Jerry Bruckheimer, by this stage, had brought in all the technical advisors needed to work out how to undertake the heist if they were actually going to do it. And as Cage added, I got to do it in a tuxedo. So that was interesting to me as well. And so Cage, an offer was made to him and he duly signed on the dotted line. And so in May 2003, finally, Variety announced that it was actually definitely happening with a movie star in place. It noted now it was going to be an August 2003 start date for the film. It was going to be a 2004 release. Disney, in the midst of all of this, with Jerry Bruckheimer, of course, also involved, was working on its Pirates of the Caribbean, its first Pirates of the Caribbean movie that would go, it would just go bananas that year. And so National Treasure would be on the slate not far behind that. By the time it got to get its green light, it was acknowledged that 9 different writers had come in and worked on the script, and the 2 who got it over the line were the writing team of Marianne and Cormac Wibberley. And at that stage, it was all ready to go. The rest of the cast could come in. Diane Kruger came in and she did her screen test opposite Nicolas Cage and got cast. In came Harvey Keitel, John Voight, Sean Bean, Justin Bartha, Christopher Plummer. They were able to really pick and choose who they wanted for this one. And as Turteltaub explained, he said, most movies I've done came together very easily. This is the first one I've been involved in putting together from scratch. He said, it's 3 years since I completed The Kid, but getting Cage was worth it. There was just time for Jerry Bruckheimer to bring in the Pirates of the Caribbean writing pair of Terry Rossio and Ted Elliott to do a final polish of the script. Then there was room for a little bit of rehearsal time. And finally, in September 2003, filming could begin on National Treasure. And I mean, it's quite a location-driven shoot for large parts of this. The film went around the US. It went to Utah, Philadelphia, New York, to Washington. And the number of locations was key, really, to get across the fact that this was a fast-moving action-adventure that would be a role slightly different to the ones that Cage had played before. Now, obviously, one of the cornerstone scenes of National Treasure, I don't think I'm going into heavy spoiler territory here, is the moment where they go to Independence Hall in the US to try and steal the Declaration of Independence. That is where the Declaration is housed, and obviously they couldn't take a camera crew with all the lights and all the bits and bobs there to shoot the sequences for the movie. They were able to do bits and bobs around there, but instead what they were grateful to was a man called Walter Knott. Now, Walter Knott had built a replica of Independence Hall on his land, on his farm, and he built this in the 1960s. And they went and took a look at this, and it's just like, well, that's just the ticket. So they hired that so that they could film a sequence that we see in the movie of Cage running along its roof. And as many noted at the time, there's no way on this earth they would have been able to do that for the real thing. Now, Cage, Kruger and Justin Bartha and Cage did several interviews around this at the time, would let off steam and go off and do karaoke from time to time during the production. And what Cage was trying to channel really was the kind of classic Cary Grant style of character, and he would cite films like To Catch a Thief. And he said, when I read the script, there was something else I was reading, and my character in the other one was wearing a jumpsuit. And he said, so I thought the tux would look better for this. And he said, I like films like To Catch a Thief. There was a very restrained approach to the way the guys did their robberies, and the fact that his character seemed to have the same kind of ethos in National Treasure is one of the things that really appealed to him. Now, Cage and Sean Bean got on, and I mean, there was an anecdote from the filming of the movie where Nicolas Cage invited Sean Bean round to his house for an evening game of pool. And as Sean Bean described it, the pool room is sort of a prehistoric cave, and it's full of fossils and skulls of different animals. And Bean says, I think we both of us had a few drinks, and Nick fell over and his pool cue knocked this bear skull to the ground, and it smashed to pieces, and he wanted to bury it, to return it to the earth or something like that. Sean Bean's suggestion, no, I'll just get some glue and stick the thing back together. The extensive shoot would wrap up in early 2004 after 6 months. By this stage, Pirates of the Caribbean, The Curse of the Black Pearl had gone on to be a huge success. And so when the first cut of National Treasure came in, I mean, it was nearly 4 hours long, which is not unusual. But there was a sense, really, that there might be another hit of Pirates of the Caribbean style in the film. Now, that was ultimately, hardened that viewpoint when the film was eventually submitted to the MPAA in the US to get a rating for the movie. And to the surprise, really, they came back with a PG rating rather than a PG-13. This led to a change of strategy from Disney, in that no longer would it release National Treasure under the Touchstone banner. It was now going to release it as a Disney film, that it realised it might have another big Disney hit on its hands. The post-production was challenging for the visual effects team at a company called Asylum, and they had to come up with around 350 shots in the movie, in particular the stuff in and around the Declaration itself. And then the aforementioned Da Vinci Code book by Dan Brown, that had been published and was becoming a bestseller at this point. And there were questions. I read an Entertainment Weekly report in a preview of National Treasure that was raising the question, would people really be interested in a film like this when in fact people were just going to buy the Da Vinci Code and having that and enjoying that kind of adventure in that book instead? Whatever you think of the book of the Da Vinci Code, at some point I will come to the Da Vinci Code movies, quite a few stories behind that. And so they were also, one of the things they went into this film with was no plan for a sequel, and they were pretty candid about this because they were increasingly being asked about it. Pirates was going to get 2 very, very quick sequels, but by the time the film had come to the UK, for instance, the film was already out in the US and had already been a hit. And so the questions when the cast and crew came over to the UK were primarily around sequels, and Jerry Bruckheimer was pretty candid at that point. It's just like, we've not got an idea for a sequel at the moment, but we're going to look into something along those lines. Of course, coming up against also that Nicolas Cage wasn't making sequels at that point. I mean, he was committed to go go off and do Lord of War straight afterwards, and then the Ghost Rider film that had been in gestation for some time at that point. But, I mean, first and foremost, they had to get this first film. I jumped a little bit ahead of the story there because they had to get this first film out into the open. And it released in the US on November the 19th, 2004. And the reception to it was, I mean, critically, it was pretty good. There was still, the inevitable criticisms that the plot seemed a little bit far-fetched. You can pretty much see that. And also because it was trying to capture the feel of things like Raiders of the Lost Ark. I mean, that's holding a very high bar for a film like this to try and navigate. Even 1999's The Mummy. I mean, that was one that clearly got very close to that kind of feel, and so that too was just being held up as some touch point. We look back now when films like National Treasure feel like a very, very rare beast. I mean, films like Jungle Cruise have tried to recapture that feel, and I would suggest have struggled to do so. And perhaps we're a little bit more spoilt with films like National Treasure than we realised at the time. That said, the audiences certainly turned up to see it. When it launched into US cinemas, it opened with 35 million on its opening weekend, in first place as well. The other big opener that weekend, I mean, this was high season as well, really, November 2004. The first SpongeBob SquarePants movie had arrived with $32 million, so that was no slouch either. The other films that were around at that point, The Incredibles had held the top spot for a couple of weeks. That was now down to 3. The Polar Express was in its second week. The Bridget Jones sequel was in there. Ray, which will go on to win an Oscar for Jamie Foxx, was down at number 7. The first Saw movie, remember when there was only one? That was sat in 10th place and earned a cool $50 million for Lionsgate. But in the case of National Treasure, it was just the kind of live-action family adventure movie that Disney knew would just play throughout the Christmas season. And so it proved. I mean, it held the top spot the week afterwards, holding off competition from things like Christmas with the Cranks and Alexander. The week after, it was top again. 3 straight weeks there as Closer opened to try and dislodge it. And it wouldn't be until Ocean's 12 and Blade Trinity opened the same weekend, 10th of December of 2004, that National Treasure would find itself knocked down finally to 3rd place. Now, that said, it still hung around the chart for several more weeks, and by the time it had finished its US run, it had grossed $173 million, and this was a sizable hit. The film was calculated to have cost somewhere in the region of $100 million to make, and when you threw in its international gross as well, which pretty much matched the US gross, dollar for dollar, the worldwide take for the film came in total $347 million. So no wonder people were asking questions about a sequel. I mean, it didn't finish its theatrical run until summer the following year. It was still playing in dollar theatres and on the family circuit, and the questions were coming fast and furious. Would there be a National Treasure 2? And so, I mean, here is a spoiler. Yes, there would be a National Treasure 2, and that film, entitled Book of Secrets, would follow Christmas 2007, so fairly quickly in the slipstream of this, considering the other projects that Nicolas Cage had to fit in as well. Then in the aftermath of that, question marks remained about a National Treasure 3, which, I mean, almost to this day, those questions still keep coming up. And, I mean, by the mid-2010s, even though we were nearly a decade after the second movie, there was still talk about a 3rd film coming. Now, the latest we had on this was at the start of 2020. A writer was brought in to pen a fresh script for it. However, what might have usurped all of this is that in the spring of 2020 came the news that Disney Plus was ordering a National Treasure TV series, and that has now been greenlit. And at the time of this podcast being recorded, we've not seen it yet, but there are going to be, 10 episodes of this. It's currently filming. Catherine Zeta-Jones is in the ensemble alongside Lisette Alexis, Lyndon Smith, Zuri Reed, Jake Austin Walker. And so that will continue the National Treasure saga. Now, set against all of this, Nicolas Cage is back making films with big studios. At the time of recording, he's filming Renfield for Universal. And of course, he's appeared in the film The Unbearable Weight of Massive Talent, where he recreates lots of Nicolas Cage roles. That has opened questions about revisiting lots of his previous roles. And so whilst it feels unlikely we'll get a National Treasure 3, it's not something I think you can utterly rule out. What is clear is Hollywood has really struggled to recapture this tone and this flavour of action adventure, often drowning the films that we've seen in more recent times with far too many visual effects and not actually remembering that it's characters that we enjoy seeing and the comedy of them and the interaction of them. And National Treasure, you could argue it's a little bit too long. I would still argue it's an enormous amount of fun. I'd quite happily watch a third one. I don't think I'm alone. Which brings me to the halfway point of this latest episode of Film Stories. Thank you, as always, for listening. I'm just going to do a few notices here and then get on to the second film that I'm going to talk about. First and foremost, I've got some new magazines up for sale. That issue 32 of Film Stories magazine, leading with a huge interview with Peter Capaldi about his filmmaking work. That is now shipping, as is issue 9 of Film Junior magazine, which leads with exclusive interviews around Sonic movie. Now, what I think is really interesting about those interviews, they've been conducted by a young reporter, and it's a really delightful piece of work, and if you can support that, I'd be hugely grateful. You can find those at store.filmstories.co.uk. If you like this podcast and don't mind supporting it, there are 3 ways you can do so. If you go to Patreon at patreon.com/Simon Brew and put a bit of money in there, you get virtually all of the podcasts early. You get bits and bobs of gossip of what we're up to behind the scenes. I've just put the audio of my latest live show up as well, so that's all available there. If you can subscribe to this podcast, that helps enormously. Independent podcasts like mine live and die on algorithms a lot of the time and recommendations. And the other thing you could do that would really help there is leave ideally a hugely positive review. That kind of thing is just gold dust. But I think I'm going to end my notices there and instead get on with the second of the 2 films I'm going to talk about. Now, I have an absolute weakness and a half for futuristic prison movies. And the film I'm going to talk about, I don't think it's one that many of you will have seen, but I just remember going to see this in a big multiplex in the 1990s in the UK. And we didn't get it until a little while after its American release, and having an absolute blast. They really don't make them like this anymore, I would suggest. Let me play you a clip, and then I'm going to tell you all about Fortress.
A high-tech prison.
Who started the incident?
Built to withstand anything.
Let's find out.
Except an innocent man.
We go tomorrow morning.
Activate the strike clone.
Christopher Lambert. Fortress, where the punishment is the ultimate crime.
Going out won't be fun. Oh, but it's gonna be a trip.
Just get it in my veins. That is a clip from 1992 science fiction futuristic prison movie Fortress, directed by Stuart Gordon, written by Troy Neighbours and Stephen Feinberg, and starring Christopher Lambert, Kurtwood Smith, Lauren Loughlin, Lincoln Kilpatrick, Clifton Collins Jr. and Vernon Wells. And more people might have heard of Fortress if it had followed its original path of being an Arnold Schwarzenegger vehicle, because that's what the project was originally developed as. That 20th Century Fox was investing in the film as a possible film for Arnold Schwarzenegger to do. And as the film's eventual director, the late great Stuart Gordon, would explain to Videoscope, with Arnie on board, that brought with it a sizable budget. Now, this was in the period where Schwarzenegger's career was fast accelerating to the point of peaking. So in 1990 with Total Recall and 1991 with Terminator 2, I would suggest were the height of his absolute blockbuster powers. And that was the stage, particularly after Terminator 2, where studio after studio was lining up to lure him to make their big summer blockbuster film. So Fox had the idea of Fortress and was pushing that forward. Of course, Schwarzenegger would eventually go on and do Last Action Hero as his choice. I've covered that fairly recently in the podcast. But for the purposes of this one, there's just some loose links just to tie up here. Because one interview, for instance, suggests that what Schwarzenegger did here was he was the one who brought Stuart Gordon, who directed Reanimator, to the film. Now, when Gordon had been making Reanimator, he'd reportedly used Peter Kent, who was Schwarzenegger's body double in that film. And so that's how Schwarzenegger got to know about it. And he liked the film and he put on a screening. And one of the people who was at the screening was a producer by the name of John Davis. Now, Davis at this point had the rights to the Fortress script that had been put together by Troy Neighbours and Stephen Feinberg. And he was the one who loosely knitted this group of people together. However, when Schwarzenegger turned it down, so 20th Century Fox's interest ended, and the idea of this being a $60-70 million futuristic prison movie, imagine that, was over. And so the script got put into turnaround, and it needed another buyer. So in this case, it found one. Now, Village Roadshow Pictures is an operation, a company that has partnered with lots of Hollywood studios on big blockbusters over the last decade or two. But it had been founded, in 1986, and it was still pretty much in its infancy at this stage. It partnered with Warner Brothers, for instance, on the film Dead Calm, terrific movie that is. But still, it was building things up at this stage. It was on the lookout for new projects, and so it became aware of the Fortress script, and it decided to pick the project up from 20th Century Fox. And the move from 20th Century Fox to Village Roadshow instantly knocked the budget down by 75%. That Village Roadshow reckoned it could raise around $14-15 million to get the film going. Now, that's when Stuart Gordon got the call. Now, Stuart Gordon's career, Stuart Gordon's the one who was all set to direct Honey, I Shrunk the Kids. Can you imagine if they put from the director Reanimator on that poster until he was unable to, just due to personal circumstances. But he had a track record of making films, genre films, well on a low budget. Now, he took a look at the Fortress script and he knew he wanted to make changes to it because the lead character at that point, John Brennick, was very much written for Arnold Schwarzenegger. And what Gordon argued was, if you're going to send someone into a futuristic prison, you've got to make them more of an everyman. You've got to have them as someone a lot more relatable, not the biggest action star in the world. And so at that stage, with the script being rewritten to accommodate that, the question was, who could star in the film? And the script did the rounds. And as Gordon would explain later, and in fact, there's a whole book of interviews with Stuart Gordon I should give a plug to, from University Press in Mississippi, called Conversations with Filmmakers. Gordon would explain that he got a call from Christopher Lambert saying that he'd read the script and he liked it very much. And Lambert was asking Gordon if he was okay with him starring in the movie. And so in an interview with the Los Angeles Times, Stuart Gordon would expand on this. And he'd say very, very few leading men, particularly action stars, ever want to appear vulnerable or scared on screen. Now, this being the early 1990s, I think there was something to that. He would explain they always want to be macho and tough where nothing phases them. And he says, to me, that makes them seem stupid. To me, a hero is not someone who's unafraid. It's someone who does things in spite of the fact that they're scared. And Christopher is not afraid to be afraid. Now, Lambert at this point was primarily known for Highlander, a film for which that there was not only one. And the thinking was this was just the kind of action project that could raise his profile. Might this be the film that could break him into the American market properly? Because he'd already landed a couple of notable roles in Subway, for instance, and the lead in Greystoke as well. But they'd not turned him into a star of the level of some of the other people we were talking about, the Schwarzeneggers and such like, Van Damme's. Could he possibly break in? So with Lambert interested and on board, and after taking a few years to get a green light, things then happened really quickly, because Christopher Lambert went to the Cannes Film Festival in 1991 to help try and raise the money for the film that Village Roadshow wanted to sell off all sorts of rights, just to raise the budget for this one. And it came together incredibly quickly at that stage. That company, Columbia TriStar was picking up the international rights for this one. Columbia Home Video was going to have it in the US as well, and the money was raised. The problem was, because of the way the rights had been sold, the film needed to be delivered to a deadline. And they came back from the Cannes Film Festival that year, and the race was on to make the film within 12 months. Now, the problem they got with this is absolutely nothing had been built for it. That, for a start, Stuart Gordon was coming in off the back of, hard off the back of another film he was making, The Pit and the Pendulum. And so in June 1991, only at that stage could the work properly begin on the special effects that were required for the movie. And this was going to be a futuristic prison. It was going to need special effects. And then also designing the prison itself, the fortress, the underground futuristic incarceration centre, where Christopher Lambert was going to be sent, obviously an innocent man, and terrible that he was sent there, and try and get out of it all. So, what they used as a template was a maximum security prison in California called Pelican Bay. Now, Fortress couldn't afford to film in California, but Pelican Bay at this point was used to house what was described as the worst of the worst. But also of interest to Stuart Gordon and the production team was this was a very high-tech prison, certainly by the standards of where prison technology was at the time. I'm no expert on that, I should know. But it was to the point, so dangerous were regarded the inmates, to even get in to have a look, they had to sign waivers that acknowledged if they were taken hostage, they knew that no one would come in to try and rescue them. They would have to wear stab-proof vests to go around the prison, but also were told that don't worry about the vest because they'll go for the eyes anyway. They won't try and stab you in the chest, so that's nice. But what they found was a very, very quiet prison, that the inmates were in their cells for 22 and a half hours a day. What they also found was a very bright prison. Now, this goes against how prisons, certainly futuristic prisons, I've watched a few of these movies, tend to be presented on the big screen, that they're dark, and they're dingy, and they're hellholes to some degree, or there's flashing lights absolutely everywhere. But what they discovered was that the Pelican Bay prison needed to be light, because otherwise you couldn't use all the technology, you couldn't use all the cameras, you just wouldn't be able to see everything there. And so Gordon took that, and that was woven into the fortress we see on screen, which is unusually bright for a feature prison. And as he explained, all the security cameras and tools that were in there, they just took that to its logical conclusion, to the point where it just had one person running the show. Now, that's not how Pelican Bay was being set up, but they did the sci-fi thing of let's map out how this could go if it all went badly wrong over the next 20, 30 years. This also led to them introducing into the script the intestinator. God love the intestinator, which they figured that was the logical extension of tracking devices that inmates were having to wear. Now, what the intestinator does is, I really don't want to spoil it if you've not seen the film. Let's just say that if the prison warden calls out for some intestinations, or the glorious line random intestinations, it leaves an assortment of prisoners in pain. Let's just say it that way. Gordon also knew that he might have been making a fictional film, but he actually wanted to say something about prisons and the way that prisons were in America, the makeup of the inmate population in America, and he just felt that they were in such a state and there was a scandal there. And he figured if he was actually going to make a documentary, which he hadn't been intending to do anyway, then people wouldn't really take notice of it or wouldn't believe. But if you stick something like this in the middle of popular entertainment, you might just get some degree of message across. With the fortress thus designed, they knew what they were going to do, and so they also knew that they were going to be filming this in Australia. It was going to be much cheaper to do it, and that's where Village Roadshow Pictures was set up as well. John Davis's Davis Entertainment Company will co-produce the film, and so they went to Australia, and depending which Stuart Gordon interview you follow, they either built 3 or 4 stories of cell blocks for the 11-story prison that we see in the film. One thing that does seem to be agreed on was the set at that stage was the largest ever built in Australia. Even the miniature version that they used, and there's so many practical effects in this film, was 30 feet long. They didn't do things by halves there. With Lambert on board, they were also bringing the rest of the co-stars as well. I would suggest one of the coups here was getting in Kurtwood Smith, at that point probably best known for Dead Poets Society, to play the evil warden of the prison. Jeffrey Combs, Tom Towles also came in, and the aforementioned members of the Vernon Wells, Clifton Collins Jr. And they threw themselves into research. So Jeffrey Combs and Tom Towles, for instance, started interviewing prisoners for the role. Lambert was locked in a cell for a while. And then Stuart Gordon had to sort of make a call as to which of the projects he was juggling he would go on to, because at that stage he'd been scripting a further remake of the classic Invasion of the Body Snatchers, but the speed at which Fortress was coming together, he was set to direct Body Snatchers but realised he couldn't, and so he dropped out of that film, and Abel Ferreira would come in and instead take it on. And I would suggest that's an underrated remake, that one. I don't think there have always been great remakes of Invasion of the Body Snatchers, but that's the one that mean, it just sort of came and went, but I think it's really quite a smart film. Stuart Gordon also at this stage, while he was making Fortress, had his contract still in place to develop family movies for Disney. He's on the credits of the Honey, I Shrunk the Kids sequel, for instance. But also he was heading straight into the production of Fortress, fresh from making The Pit and the Pendulum, which hadn't been the best of times, really, a film that he was happy with, but was all but buried by Paramount when it came time to actually release it. Against a tight deadline then, with all the challenges that they'd faced on this one, they'd managed to structure and plan Fortress and get it to a place where they could put it in front of the cameras and know what they were doing. They knew that their schedule was going to be very tight. They knew they didn't have an awful lot of time to waste once they got on set for this one, but because they in the end prepared it so thoroughly, it would make for quite a calm shoot in the scheme of things. Filming would begin in October of 1991, and they just had 45 days to get this in the can, with all the practical effects involved as well. And there was pressure on Gordon from his producers on this one, but as he would tell my old colleagues at Den of Geek, and I credit my brilliant former colleagues Duncan Bowles and Ryan Lambie with an assortment of interviews they did with Lambert and Stuart Gordon. And I mean, Lambert would explain that Stuart Gordon had to fight to a degree against the producers to get what he wanted, and that he insisted to them, trust me, let me do my things. And because he wasn't going over budget and had got everything in place, he was ultimately allowed to make the film that he wanted to make out of Fortress. Now, what this also meant for people like Lambert and Vernon Wells was that the stunts were going to be done practically, and as Gordon said, they pretty much did them in their entirety as well. And he explained the only time Christopher and I got into a fight was when he got angry with me when I didn't want him to stand in front of a truck at the end with a flamethrower when it was coming at him. And so they shot that scene very, very early in the production, and as Stuart Gordon explained to his star, it's going to be very hard for me to finish the movie if you get run over by a truck. And he said eventually we compromised. The stunt guy did the first take, he did the second take, and what do you know, the second take was the one that they ended up using. Now, Gordon seemed to, we lost a couple of years ago, tragically, he seemed to love making this film. I mean, he would explain, we were in a place called Surfers Paradise, and he said it was the most beautiful beach in the world. He described the turquoise water, the white sand, and here we are making this movie that's supposed to be in this dark future. You know, the deepest hole on earth is how he described it. And he said the contrast was really incredible. And he also told a lovely story about how they used practical effects to save a bit of money on the film. Because this was, I mean, I might have mentioned that this involved a future prison, and one of the design facets of the prison was that it had laser bars on the cells. Now, if you were making that film today, that's easy. You just put them all on in post-production. The tools are there and affordable, even for lower budget productions. But at this stage, it would mean every time they had prison bars, they had bars on the prison cells, they would have to do a second optical shot of each scene so that they could impose the necessary effects in post-production. And in fact, it was the film's cinematographer in the end, David Egby, who came up with a different way of approaching it. And they made rods out of a product Scotchlight. And because of then the way that Egby shot that, it said it allowed us to have characters walking in front of them and still look like these laser bars. And he said it turned out to be a tremendous saving. It saved us probably $500,000 right there by being able to do things on set. Now, Kurtwood Smith has done an assortment of really much loved roles on film and TV, and so he wasn't necessarily the person you would expect, although, you know, Clarence Bodiger, to turn up in Fortress as a hard-nosed prison warden. But apparently he was having an absolute ball, as Gordon would explain. He said, what I remember of working with Kurtwood was he would just keep saying, let me do another take, I can do it better. And so I'd say, okay, and he'd do another take and it'd be better. Then he'd say, let me do it one more time, I think I can do it even better. And what Gordon said is, I realised after a while that we could just keep shooting forever with him because he always found a way to improve. Now, Village Roadshow at this stage had just bought a studio complex in Australia from producer Dino De Laurentiis and was in the midst of turning it into a theme park as well. And it had this plan that when it opened the theme park in Australia, it wanted a real movie to be shooting in and around this studio, just as an extra attraction. And so they had studio tours running on trams that they'd taken the idea of that from Universal Studios in Florida and in Los Angeles. And he said one day at lunch, Vernon and Jeff climbed onto the tram in their prison uniforms and hijacked it with their fake guns. And the park people said the tourists loved it. Can you do it every day? And the problem with that one was, no, they couldn't. But that was an extra treat for the people who went along to said theme park ride at that particular point. Now, filming would wrap up on Fortress in December of 1991, and I mean, the film would not appear for another year. So there was a bit of post-production time, but things were also happening in that post-production time. Because for one, Columbia TriStar Home Video sold the American theatrical rights to the film to Miramax in early 1993. Miramax, of course, headed up by convicted rapist Harvey Weinstein. And in early 1993, Miramax was sold to Disney, and so it had a massive influx of funds that he could spend on doing other things. By the time it got to the American release of the film, though, Fortress had been released in Hungary and South Korea, first of all, at the end of 1992, and then it got its Australian release in 1993. Now, the original critical response to this was, I mean, it wasn't bad, actually. Certainly for a genre film where you get quite a lot of snobbery a lot of the time, there was a feeling that its world building was good, that it had something to say. Bits of it were a little bit shonky, but generally the critical response was fine. The audience response, however, was, on its initial release, far better than you may expect, or certainly have remembered if you remember the film coming first time round, because by the time it got to 1993 and the film's ultimate release in America in September of that year, Fortress was heavily in profit. That it had cost in the end $12 to $14 million to make, but it had already grossed $60 million. It had opened in number one at the box office in Australia, in Korea, in Germany, in Spain, in Italy, in France. And off the back of this, Miramax was quite buoyed by this. Now, it felt that this was going to be the perfect film for its new, more genre-driven imprint, Dimension Films. At this point, its widest release had been an animated film, Freddy FR07, a fairly forgettable family movie with a frog and a James Bond link to it. I do vaguely remember watching that as well. And Dimension at this point had queued up films such as Hellraiser 3 and Children of the Corn 2 on its slate. And it had some confidence, really, with Fortress, to the point where it pushed the film onto 1,200 screens, one of its biggest releases at the time for its September 1993 release. Now, even before that US release came about, there was talk that a sequel was underway, but I'm just going to quickly go through the US release first, because it opened in cinemas on September the 3rd, 1993 in the States, and still hanging around at that point was a very, very, very successful collection of films from that summer. You might have heard of them. Jurassic Park, for instance, In the Line of Fire. What do you know? Last Action Hero was still hanging around roughly in the charts at that point. But the feeling was, if you open a film in September with, relatively low expectations for its return, that there might be something in it. There might be a chance to make a bit of money there. But in the case of Fortress, I mean, the competition was coming, fast in the weeks afterwards. True Romance opened the week after in the US, for instance. There was stuff like Undercover Blues coming. There was Bruce Willis in Striking Distance. There was the new Scorsese film, The Age of Innocence. And whereas ordinarily September tended to be quite a light month for release, there was some fairly weighty stuff coming through. And then you get to the start of October, just 3 or 4 weeks later, and 2 surprise hits sprung out, Malice and Cool Runnings, and any chance Fortress had of making a dent at the US box office was pretty much gone at that point. In the end of its take around the world, it's only 6.7 million came from America, but nonetheless, the film was in profit, and it was heading to home formats where it would make even more money. And at that point, you got to see an alternative ending to the film as well, depending which version you got. And so then we got the talk of doing a Fortress 2. That Stuart Gordon was adamant that a sequel to follow at this point, and he had the idea for a film long before the TV show Prison Break came along, I should note, that Fortress 2 would have Christopher Lambert. I know it's Christopher Lambert, but I'm going with the way it's pronounced in the trailer at the start, just for consistency, having to break into the fortress to rescue his child. And so the film was being developed along those lines. designs, but ultimately it would go through quite a few changes before we ultimately saw it. And Stuart Gordon would not be the director by the time it came around. Instead, he would go on to work on films like Castle Freak and would throw his energies into things like Space Truckers and The Wonderful Ice Cream Suit and films of that ilk instead, as well as doing stage work too, it should be noted. But nonetheless, I mean, it's quite interesting hearing some of the interviews that were given around the time. So Christopher Lambert, for instance, would tell the Los Angeles Times, as it would be reported, before Fortress 2, Lambert will do Highlander 3, which he promises will be nothing at all like Highlander 2 The Quickening. As he said, I was terribly disappointed in the second one, but contractually I had to do it. And he said, this one I've got script approval and it's much more like the original. Gulp. By the time Fortress 2 came around, a couple of things. First of all, Stuart Gordon was gone. He would not be directing that. Christopher Lambert would, and it would be a straight-to-video effort in the end, or just about straight to DVD at that point. It had the glorious title Re-Entry. Fortress 2 Re-Entry. What a title for a film that is. And this time, the prison would be in space. There wouldn't be any breaking into it. They just came up with another excuse to lock Christopher Lambert up in a prison, this time in space, with a smaller budget. And you can kind of imagine how that panned out, although I still think it's quite good fun. I would also suggest it's not at the level of the first Fortress, but as a double bill, you're not going to go too far wrong. I should also acknowledge that Fortress 2 Re-Entry, which I'm still not bored of saying, was directed by a man who would turn into a sequel specialist, a fine director, Jeff Murphy, who would take on the sequels to Young Guns and Under Siege, and in fact would do quite a lot of second unit stuff on Peter Jackson's Middle-earth films as well, and we lost him fairly recently as well. That film came and went, and there was still just about talk of doing a Fortress 3, and I tip my hat to my former colleague Duncan Bowles, who asked Christopher Lambert about this, and he said, I think Stuart Gordon's an incredible director. He's incredibly smart and way ahead of a lot of people. When you look at the soldiers that he built, his robots, that's exactly what we're trying to do to go to war today. If we have to go to war, is to bring people like that. And he said it's the AI before the AI, the artificial intelligence before it happened. And he was just really praising of Gordon's eye and his ability to peer into the future and see where things might go and fashion a piece of entertainment from him. Sadly, there's no sign of Fortress 3. I don't think it will happen. Christopher Lambert has gone on to he's gone back to dramatic films and had to, for an assortment of reasons, step away from film work as well. But if you're looking on this podcast to occasionally discover a film that you might not have heard of before, and you just want to steer towards something that's worth digging out, if you in any way share my love of futuristic prison movies, and ironically Arnie will go on and make one with Stallone called Escape Plan that couldn't hold a torch to this, do dig out Fortress. It's just the kind of film, here comes the cliche, they really don't make anymore, and I bloody wish they would. Which brings me to the end of this latest episode of Film Stories, and thank you as always for listening. Nicolas Cage and futuristic prisons in the same episode. I don't think I can do more than that, really. If I've not bored you completely, you can find more from me on Twitter at Simon Brew. You can find more from the entire Film Stories project at Film Stories Pod. You can find us on Facebook at facebook.com/filmstoriesonline. We're on YouTube at youtube.com/filmstories. If you go to store.filmstories.co.uk, that's where you'll find all of our magazines, loads of them now, as well as our sneakers Blu-ray. We'll be shipping another bunch of those out fairly recently too. You can find the Film Stories website at filmstories.co.uk, and that's updated every weekday with movie news, reviews, features, mayhem, all sorts on there too. And you'll also find details of my next live show, which is coming to Birmingham on Wednesday, May the 18th at the Midlands Arts Centre here in the UK. You can find ticket details there, and if you want to listen to the last show, head over to patreon.com/Simon Brew, and it's available on there. All that said and done, I'm going to go and sit down and watch Fortress again now, because it's really put me in the mood talking about it. So I leave you in peace. I thank you as always for listening, and I thank you for your time. You all take care of yourselves. I'll be back soon with another bunch of film stories. Bye-bye.
Shall I intestinate?
No.